Welcome to Dan Lee Boat Building, where we are currently restoring a Healey 75, the boat which you can see behind me here. If you've seen any of the previous videos in this series, then you will know that this boat has had quite a hard life, and we've done a lot of work so far with straightening out the bottom of the boat, reinforcing it with biaxial glass, and rebuilding all of the internal woodwork that makes up its structure. In this video we are going to be turning the boat over again and starting to work towards applying the new paint finish to the outside. In the run up to that, there are several stages that need to come first in order to ensure that we can get a nice looking and long lasting paint finish on the boat. Throughout the video I will explain each of the different processes that we go through, the products that we're using and the reasoning behind the process, all with the end result of getting a nicely faired, shiny looking boat. So the first thing to do is to get the boat turned over again. As you can see, we still have the keel timber in place that we use to straighten out the misshapen keel. Now that we have all of the internal structure of the boat reinstalled, we can remove that timber, and with a bit of luck everything will stay put, which it did. Lovely. So previously we did a lot of work in straightening out the bottom, pulling the boat back into shape and getting it physically back to where it should be. However, this was really only the first stage of fairing, and to give you an idea, we probably got it within around plus or minus 5mm in most areas. If we were to go straight on with a paint finish on the boat now, it would look shiny, but as a whole the boat would look awful, with large ripples that would show through in the finish. So we need to undertake a further set of processes in order to get the boat back in shape for a good cosmetic finish. We made the decision to remove the gel coat on this boat. The gel coat is the original finish system that was used on the boat, and it's a thick layer of pigmented polyester resin that is laid up in the mould before the structural fiberglass mat is laid over the top. It's a very efficient way of finishing a fiberglass moulding, as it means that the boat already has its finish applied to it when it's removed from the mould. It also offers a very hard wearing finish to the outside of the boat. However, in the case of this boat, it is now in very bad condition, and even if we were to paint over it, the issues present would almost certainly continue to resurface down the line. If we take a look over the bottom of the boat, you can see a number of problems here. There are deep cracks in the gel coat, most likely induced from impacts over the years, and these have created small fractures in the surface of the gel coat. Now that these are filled with dirt and grime, they are highly visible, and if we were to paint over the top of these, they would just reappear further down the line. You can also see a large amount of blisters in the surface, and these are from what we call osmosis, which is where water is actually absorbed by the fiberglass and held within it, created by the capillary action of water tracking down the strands of the fiberglass mat. Long term, this can cause a lot of issues, for example in the colder months when the water can freeze in the glass and create cracks and faults. So to be sure that we eradicate these issues, because they were over large portions of the boat's surface, we decided to remove the gel coat entirely. Upon doing an initial grind of the surface, you can see the various layers that we have going on here. We have 4 different paint or primer layers: white, gold, white and purple. Then we get into the original gel coat layer, which is the creamy layer, and that is followed by a more white gel coat layer. Now this is probably the original colour of the boat's gel coat, and the creamier layer is most likely caused by discoloration over the years. Following on from that, you can start to see the chopped strands appearing within the fiberglass mat. Our aim when grinding back the bottom is to just break through to this layer over most of the boat's surface. So I made a start on this with a belt sander. I'm using a 40 grit belt sander, very coarse, but we have a lot of hard resin to remove, and we want to cut that back as quickly as possible. As I start to do the first passes here, you can see that the surface very quickly tells a story of what's going on. We can see longitudinal lines appearing indicating high spots that correspond to the internal floor stringers. The good thing about using a belt sander for this process is that its long bed bridges low spots, and if used correctly, it actually serves quite a good tool for an initial stage of fairing. If I were to do this process with a small rotary sander, it would likely just follow the shape of what's there, and that's not really what we want. We want to skip across the top of the high spots and miss the low spots until we bring everything down evenly. So after a few passes over the surface, things started to work out quite nicely actually. What we found was that by the time we had got through to the chopped strand layer on the high spots, we had also started to catch most of the low spots with the sander, meaning that in the process of removing the gel coat, we actually managed to fair out most of the remaining undulations in the bottom. As I mentioned earlier, we're probably only talking about a difference of no more than a few millimeters here, but it all matters with regards to a paint finish. Here you can see the first grinding stage complete. You may or may not be able to see it on video, but the boat already gives a much better sense of being back to shape. We then worked our way through grinding back the various other parts of the boat. The sides were done with a rotary grinder / polisher, as this favoured the shape of the sides much better. Because they weren't so misshapen, they didn't really have the same need for bridging the high spots so much. We also used a small file sander for doing the detailed areas around the forward spray rails. When we got to fairing off the transom, you can see a whole host of things going on here within the layers. Throughout the years of filling, repairs and painting, there are several different iterations of products here. They're all pretty well bonded in place though, and nothing is loose or flaky, so we were actually happy to leave most of this in place. But you can see how unfair the transom is right now. When I run this board along the surface, you can see that the shape changes from concave to convex across its width, and this is something that we're going to aim to correct within the fairing process. So on the outside of the boat, the only area that now needed some additional reinforcement was the spray rails. These are a commonly weak area on these boats and they very often crack. This boat had cracks showing along the faces and the seams of the spray rails. For this reason, we wanted to cover them with some additional glass. Because we didn't want to lose the detail of their shape, we're using quite a lightweight plain weave glass cloth. I wanted something that was going to form nicely around the internal corners and ends of these sections. So we begin by roughly cutting out some sections of glass and marking their positions on the boat. We're going over the spray rails and then up the sides and the bottom of the boat by around about an additional 5 inches. Once we have the glass cut to size, we remove it and we wet out the area of the boat with epoxy. Pre-wetting out the area helps us to position the glass on the surface, holding it in place, and it also helps to wet out the existing substrate. The old glass and gel coat is quite porous, and I didn't want this area to be absorbing the resin and drying out the laminate. So we lay the glass in place and then we ensure it is completely wet out. We did this using a combination of our fingers and brushes. We actually found that our fingers worked quite well for pushing the glass into place. Once that was in place, we covered everything with peel ply, and if you haven't seen it yet, take a look at the Healey Restoration Part 2 video where I discuss the use of peel ply and its benefits within this process. Once the epoxy has fully cured, then the peel ply can be removed, leaving us with a nicely prepped surface with which to continue work. Then we began the process of the first filling stage. Here we're looking to identify the largest areas that need to be filled, the biggest low spot pockets, and one of the most major areas that jumped out on this boat to us were 2 patches along the chines. We eventually came to the conclusion that these low spots must have been in the original moulding. As they are right on the junction of the chine, there isn't really any way that these could have formed over time, as it would have meant deforming the whole side of the boat. When we were looking down the lines of the chines, we could see a definitive kink in its line. And since filming this, I've actually spoken to another Healey 75 owner that has confirmed that his boat had the same defect in it. So these boats definitely had this with them from new. I can only imagine what this hollow must have done for the boat's performance, as it certainly wouldn't have done it any favours, that's for sure. So we wanted to get this corrected, and firstly I had to determine just how deep the hollow was, and the way that I did that was to run a batten over the surface of the hull. As you can see, by holding down the batten to the outer areas of the recess, it will form a fair curvature over the hollow, and this gives an indication of where the hollow starts and ends, but more importantly how deep it is in its worst point. As you can see, we're probably looking at around about 5 to 8 millimeters here, and that has a bearing on what product I'm going to be able to use to fill this area. I didn't want to just use a body filler or even a fairing compound for a void that was that deep, as it was likely to crack out over time. We want to use something with a little bit more binding agent in it that's going to offer some reinforcement. Therefore, we decided to use a product that me and Will have now named Catstick, and that is about the best way to describe its texture during application. The Catstick is a mixture of West System epoxy resin and their 402 milled glass fibre additive. This is essentially sections of chopped glass strand and is very similar to what the entire boat is actually made from. So we do an initial fill of the deepest areas with this product, following a walk around the boat marking the areas that needed addressing. Following on from that, there were a lot of damaged corners to rebuild. Sections along the chines and keel that had been damaged over the years, but also some pretty big underlying voids within the original layup that started to rear their head with some investigation. All of these areas were filled with epoxy thickened with West System high density filler additive. This additive gives a really nice smooth hard finish filler and is great for these sorts of areas where a softer type of filler may crack and break out. It also shapes very nicely post curing to form a sharp edge that will help us to redefine the keel and chine lines later on. As you can see, I'm using my newly favoured epoxy tool for this to load out the epoxy and form some nice fillets along the internal corners of the aft rubbing rails as well. Once that process was complete, we moved over to the fairing compound, and this is a softer, more easily sandable product that will allow us to sculpt the overall shape of the boat to a finer detail. Now we're talking about low spots and areas probably no more than 2mm deep. And the product we use for this is West System epoxy thickened with their 407 low density filler additive. The reason I like this product combination is that you can control the consistency of the product. Because you're adding the filler to the resin, you have a say over how thick it is. The more additive that you put in, the firmer the mixture will be and the easier it will be to sand. For the most part here, I am probably mixing this to a consistency something close to a bread or pasta dough, so pretty thick. The process for application of this is a metal tiling trowel. As the mixture is so firm, you need something that is pretty tough to move it around the surface, and a plastic tool would probably not be up to the job. If you've ever done any plastering at home, then this process is almost identical to that in consistency and application method. So I work around the boat with a trowel doing passes in various different directions. Using this method, you can actually have a surprising amount of feel for what is going on in the surface and where you need to put the product. By working it out until I can see the high spots showing through, I also know that I'm not putting too much product on there overall. The more detailed areas around the spray rails get done with the silicone spatula, as this helps to form a really nice finish around the curves. After that is cured, we give the boat a wash down with warm water and a small amount of washing up liquid. Because there is a high amount of epoxy resin on there, we will see some amine blush on the surface. A quick wash down ensures that we can get rid of this and progress with the fairing process without any clogging of the paper or contamination of the surface. So then we begin the first hand fairing process. Me and Will set to work on the boat with hand sanding blocks. We got a range of them here, but we found that the best ones for the job initially were these rigid 400mm boards. So we do passes over the surface at opposing 45-degree angles, followed by passes with a slightly longer, more flexible board at 0 degrees, lengthways down the boat. The forward sections of the boat get done with a slightly more flexible board, and the spray rails are done by hand or with a small block. Here you can see what we have after the first round. Faired areas are clearly identifiable by the plus and minus 45-degree scratch marks. High spots you can see are breaking through as the white gel coat areas, and low spots are still untouched areas of fairing compound. We now take a second look over the boat, and you can see that I'm using the batten again to see how we're progressing with the low chine patches. As we walk around the boat, we identify the remaining low spots, marking their approximate areas and shape with a marker pen. We then did a second filling operation in these areas, and at the same time I applied the first layer of fairing compound to the side of the boat. Because the sides are in better shape and don't need as much work, I've mixed the fairing compound a little thinner here, so probably more like the consistency of peanut butter. Once that is cured, then we do a second round of fairing, following the same process as we did before. Here you can see that illustrated on the transom, where I'm working with a long semi-flexible board. I start horizontally following the curvature of the transom, and as I begin fairing you can see the high spots getting scratched, the low spots remaining untouched. The aim here is to select a fairing board that will bridge these low spots and bring the whole surface down evenly. Using a board that is too flexible here would simply follow the shape of the surface and would be no further forward in the process of creating a fair transom. So you can see that I do passes at 0 degrees, plus 45, minus 45, and then finish up with passes at 90 degrees. As you can see, there is still some work to do here on the transom, and we're not quite there yet, but what we decided to do on this boat for now was to focus on getting the bottom done and painted, and then work through the top sides and the transom once the boat was back up the right way. So for now, that is as far as we've gone with the transom. Up until now, we've left the corners of the chines sharp, so it's easier for us to sight down the lines when they're left sharp and gives a better indication of what the chine is doing. This helped us to dial in the last stages of filling in those hollows around the middle of the chines. Once we were happy with the shape of them, they got rounded off to a nice radius that will give us a softer edge for painting and everyday use of the boat. Here you can see where we are up to following the second standing stage of the fairing compound. So we've got a nicely fair surface, and the only remaining defects are small low spots such as these. At this point, we are really only left with areas that want to be corrected for minor cosmetic reasons. And from this point on, we'll do those with just a standard fast curing body filler that will allow us to fill them, sand them, and then move on quickly. So now that we're up to this stage, we can get on to the primer. There comes a point when in the filling and fairing process when you're limited on what you can see going on the surface, and at that stage an initial coat of primer gives you a nice fresh perspective of things. It gives a good solid colour all over the surface, and it will usually either look pretty good or it will raise a whole new fleet of imperfections that you now need to address. And in this case it actually came out better than we were expecting, which was good. So the primer that we're using for this is the Epifanes high build epoxy primer. Following on from the final sanding stage, we wipe down the boat with thinners, tack cloth it, and then begin applying the primer. We applied this with small flocked rollers and did around 2 coats within the same day, allowing enough time in between coats for the solvents to evaporate. Here you can see a look around the boat once the first primer coat has been applied. You can see that we have a much nicer chine line established now, and that the small remaining cosmetic marks in the surface can be easily identified. Once the epoxy primer is dried, we can begin sanding it back, and at this stage we can go over to a DA sander because there isn't really any need for using longboards anymore now that we're satisfied that the surface is fair. You can see here with successive passes of the sander exactly what the high build primer is actually doing. So it's filling some of the lower patches and also all of the deep sanding gouges that are left by the 40 grit fairing boards. Following on from that sand, we do one more process of filler using a common polyester fast setting body filler, and here we are filling the small cosmetic marks of less than probably 1mm depth. We sand again and then apply 2 more coats of epoxy primer, and that takes us up to the stage of being ready for top coat prep. So that is as far as we're going to go in this video. I hope you found it interesting and a helpful insight into the process that we used in getting this old girl back into shape. In the next video, we will be prepping the primer and applying the top coat to the bottom of the boat, and we will also be considering some of the hardware installation, and I will show you a process that I use for casting an epoxy pad in order to correctly align and support the prop shaft strut for this boat. So thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you are new, and I hope to catch you in the next video. Cheers guys.